Watch out, eh? Watch out, eh? Which is, of course, Canadian for Achtung, Achtung. And one of my very best friends is Canadian. I feel dirty after doing that. I really do. If you're listening on day of release, it's February the 8th, 77 years to the day since the launch of Operation Veritable under Field Marshal Montgomery. Oh, dear. The 1st Canadian Army. I mean, this battle, fighting
more under General Simons, I think, rather than Monty.
Well, it's under everybody, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, you've got the 1st Canadian Army, 30 Corps, the flooded Reichswald, northern part of a pincer movement from Holland into Germany, coming out of Nijmegen, the whole thing. It's like and you look at the map of Veritable. This is an enormous push. The 1st Canadian Army, second 21st Army Group, 9th under Simpson. Hodge is down at the bottom doing his bit around Monschau. You know,
well, it's a two-fisted punch, isn't it? Because Simpson's 9th Army is although American, is attached to 21st Army Group for this operation, and is the sort of second part, the right-handed fist of the punch. Yeah. And they meet before the Rhine, don't they? In the sort of southern part of the Rhineland, south of kind of sort of Goch and Issum, around that kind of. In fact, actually, I remember the Sherwood Rangers bumped and nearly shot at some Americans, I think.
That's right. Yeah.
Just south of Issum.
9th are doing Grenade, aren't they? And 21st
That's right.
Army, 21st Army Group are doing Veritable, and the idea is that 9th Army punch up sort of northeast, don't they? And 21st Army Group, the Canadian First Army really are punching down.
That's right.
From the island at Nijmegen, well, by Nijmegen, out of the the Grosbeek Heights and all that. And I was the weekend I was scrabbling around in the 79th Armoured Division official history, weirdly, well, is it an official history? It's hard to say. Apparently, it was written by.
It's a sort of sanctioned history.
It's anonymous. Apparently, it was written by. Because I sent it over to Andy Aitchison, one of our regular listeners. Andy Aitchison's. If you're a regular listener, you know who Andy is. Who's into the 52nd Lowland Division for some reason. He's totally obsessed with it. But basically, they keep coming up in it because this book, the 79th Armoured Division thing, is like this is the everything we did, because after all, they didn't fight as a division. They were attached. They were formed into wings, and then the wings were allocated through different parts of 21st Army Group. Anyway,
I'm not really sure. What I'm not sure of is why 1st Canadian Army, having done all that stuff in the Scheldt till kind of November, are suddenly kind of switched over to Veritable, given 30 Corps, which is part of 2nd Army, British 2nd Army. Yeah. I just don't really get why that happens, and I don't really get what Dempsey's doing at this point. Is he just preparing for the crossing of the Rhine? Is that
everything's gearing up for the Rhine crossing? But anyway, there's a bit in this book, right? Here we go. Meanwhile, Cleaver was clear, and a jock column of tanks, armoured cars and carriers, with infantry carried in the Kangaroos of 1st Canadian Armoured Carrier Regiment and 2 troops of 49th Armoured Personnel Carrier Regiment, set out for Kalkar. North of Bedburg, the leading tanks struck an enemy anti-tank screen of guns and Panzerfaust positions. Right? Check out what happens next. Kangaroos dropped their infantry and then were ordered to take the lead. Right? So they're using the Kangaroos with no one in them, with just the drivers in them. They're using the Kangaroos to go forward to locate the anti-tank guns, so they can. I mean,
Jesus.
So they're.
I'm sorry, Charlie. You're going to have to drive into a hail of fire.
Exactly. They're advancing to contact with the enemy because after all, you don't want to lose tanks, but Kangaroos you can afford
with
to
one
lose.
bloke in.
Yeah.
Wow. And does it say how many people get? How many Kangaroos get?
It was hardly surprising that 7 of their number were knocked out.
Wow, of how many?
It doesn't specify how many, but
9.
Yeah, exactly, or a dozen. But there you go. Because if the leading tanks hit the anti-tank screen, that's no good. You want the.
Yeah.
That's a short straw, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a massively short straw. Wow. Okay. I'm sure I photographed it once when I was down at Bovington, but I now can't find it. So that might just be in my imagination. But it just looked, when you sent it to me, it looked incredibly familiar. But you can get it on Kindle, you're saying?
Yeah, I got it on Kindle because I was sort of, I've gone down a Percy Hobart rabbit hole.
Is he one of your commanders?
No, he's not. He's not. I thought about putting him in, but he's not. And also, I've got enough tank chat in the chapter about the desert. There's enough tank chat in the Tuka chapter, because Tuka talks about, what we really wanted from a tank. Why couldn't they have built a tank that was useful in all theatres? And you sort of think, well, because they were really expecting to only use tanks in France. They weren't expecting to use them anywhere else. That's why they were shit in the desert, But tough luck. And then he sort of says, well, yeah, but when the Sherman came along, it didn't need any need minor modification for the desert, all-round tank with a proper weapon. But do you think the goalposts have moved so far and so fast since Britain was laying down tanks in 37, 38?
Yeah,
I don't know that. He's basically he. I mean, it's really interesting because he also talks about. That all the tanks and anti-tank weapons that they've got in the desert were designed for close country in France and would still be working perfectly well in close country in France. But
which is why the Germans, I suppose, to a certain extent, were still using 1940 tanks in Normandy, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, exactly. But no. So I've gone down this Hobart rabbit hole, and the thing that keeps coming up is the fact that he was named as the correspondent in someone's divorce, one of his pupils' divorce at the Staff College, and that's why people don't like him. And that's big
amazing, isn't it?
That's
the big obstacle.
Yeah, and he's regarded as a bully, and if no one if you don't go along with his ideas, he'll haul you over the coals and all that.
Is he a bit of a my way or the highway?
Yeah, completely. But basically, Andy's a rotter because he
and a cat. So do you? I mean, do you get the impression? I mean, would you like to sit down and have dinner with him? Yes, obviously.
Oh, of course, you want to pick his brains, but do
you think he was an unpleasant bloke?
I think he probably really was, and because he needs Brooke to protect him, and in the end, Brooke steps forward and offers him his patronage and protection, but it takes a while, and up to then he's relying on Churchill because Churchill keeps saying, "What's going on? Why aren't you using this chap with all the brilliant ideas?" And Brooks basically because everyone hates him, and because he's he's doing a lot of that sort of AFE research between the wars and thinks that everyone's an idiot that doesn't agree with him. And it's pretty interesting. It's amazing though how big 79th Armoured Division is by its high watermark, which is basically in the run-up to the Rhine crossing. So the campaign we're talking about now. 5 brigades, consisting of 17 regiments. Divisional strength of 21,430 all ranks.
Goodness.
1,566 tracked AFE.
How much?
1,566. Wow. A normal armoured division is 14,400 ranks and 350 AFVs.
Goodness, that is quite enlarged, isn't it?
It's the biggest division in the army.
But
of course,
and quite often it spends its time not operating as a division, does it?
Well, it's not a division. That's the point. Is it doesn't fight as a division. It's a sort of it's interesting.
It's a kind of it spreads all over the place.
Yeah, it's interesting. They keep using the word wing. So they set these wings up, and the account of the training in the run up to plunder is really interesting. They set up a training school on the Mars, and they get the DDs back out. They get the DD tanks out again, and they come up with a carpet laying scheme for basically.
And DDs are pretty good on a river, aren't they? Because there's no great big wind. It's just
yes, but your problem is the muddy bank. So they have to find a way of getting the carpet onto the bank before the DDs come. So there's always it's always this thing with landing is that there's always one more thing in front of the thing. The start of the book, there's the account of D-Day, and Le Hamel, for instance, that Avry that's blundering about Courseulles-sur-Mer, and what's really interesting in that is that this book was written in 46, and it's John Borthwick, I think, who was his ADC that wrote it. So the 1946 account of D-Day is complete chaos. It's these were late. They arrived on time. The Averys arrived before the thing that was supposed to be. It's complete. It's just acknowledging the sheer chaos of it. Partly so he can then say, but nevertheless, 79th Armoured Division, powered on through and met its objectives. But it's really sort of frank about the chaos.
Well, our chum Steve Fisher is doing a book on Sword Beach, and the work that I've read of it, it looks absolutely fantastic. I mean, and written beautifully as well, really entertaining. I mean, he really understands the importance of human drama in the narrative. I just think Stephen Fisher's book is going to be, I reckon it's going to be such an important work, actually, because I think for the first time, someone is going to forensically look at not just the landings, but at the naval operation, which, of course, enables the landings. The two are absolutely inextricably linked when it comes to D-Day, but usually separated in the narrative. So you get a little bit of, landing craft came in, it was a little bit chaotic, then they landed. But what you're going to see is actually the processes by which the weather intervened and and what they did as a result of that. And Sword Beach is interesting because it's the largest single division landing of D-Day. Because the other beaches, obviously, there's two divisions at Gold, two divisions at Omaha, but there are, I think it's swollen to 23,500 men because of the commandos and everything as well. In this incredibly narrow beachfront with a very, very high tide. Anyway, I'm sort of digressing, but the point is, I think that will be really, really fascinating. We're talking about the sort of the chaos that comes across in the 79th Armored Division booklet that was written in 1946. I think suddenly, with Steve's book, we might have a much clearer picture of exactly what that chaos was. If you
Well, I mean,
which I think is really exciting.
Well, the thing is that the impression you get from this is that there's a clear depiction of chaos, and you're getting your head around it. It's really, really quite something, and it's stuff like they chuck in that you'll chuck a fascine in a tank trap. And it won't be enough. So you've got this thing where someone parks his Avery in the hull, and they put a bridge over the Avery. The thing to do actually is use a tank as a bridge. And all of this obviously is happening under fire. So if an Avery's knocked out, the crew get out, they're killed or injured by mortaring, and you're trying to put an assault in, and then obviously, either the tanks, the armoured regiments they're supporting have just turned up, or they haven't arrived yet, or they got there first, and everyone's having to make sense of what's going on. I mean, the other thing I've been sort of mulling this week has been this. Very often when talking about the Battle of Normandy, people say, well, of course, the Germans are terribly all very experienced because. They do well because they're very experienced because they've been fighting the Russians for however long, right? And a large chunk of the British army, certainly the invasion army, the American army too, is completely green, right? And has just been all it's been doing the last 3 years really has been training in preparation for this moment. In which case, I think they did really well. My conclusion from that is that then they do really fantastically well, don't they? Like given that an awful lot of people landing in Normandy, it's their first contact with the enemy.
Yes, and in circumstances which they absolutely haven't been prepared for, which is raging winds and sort of swell and landing craft being turned 90 degrees to the direction they should be, etc., etc., etc. I agree with you. I think it's remarkable how successful it is, and that tells you two things. That tells you that the Navy was exceptional. It tells you three things. That's one thing. It tells you that the people landing were better trained than a lot of us give them credit for.
Yes,
and it also tells you the Germans weren't very good.
Well, maybe. I mean, maybe you can glean
on the crust.
Well, maybe you can glean. Maybe you. But let's say we accept the idea that the Germans are really experienced, right? That their officer, certainly their officer and their NCO, spine that runs through things is very, very experienced. Obviously, fighting a different kind of enemy in a different environment, right? Not in close country, just as we just been talking about, not in close country and without the air advantage they probably have on the Eastern Front, right? Quite. Yeah. I mean, they're more evenly matched on the Eastern Front air-wise, right? But let's accept that they're pretty good, because it leads me to the conclusion that actually the British Army's training by this point is really, really good. So So that actually it's not that they're crap when they land, and that's where the problems come from. The problems come from all these other things that you need to toss in because they've sorted out where they're getting their officers from. They've got battle drills. They've got proper combat schools and all this sort of stuff worked out. Obviously, rehearsing together in exercises, doing combined hours is basically impossible because of the lack of space, as we talked about before, and also just moving everyone around and matching everyone up, is that much harder. But I just keep coming back to this because I'm happy to accept the idea that the Germans in Normandy must be pretty good. I'm happy. I don't see that. Don't see, in the debate. Don't feel that that's a concession. You don't have to concede that the chances are they would be, because after all, and obviously the officer corps has been winnowed away, an NCO base has been winnowed away by 5 years of fighting, but also they went into the war up for it. They have a staff college tradition. They have all the officer tradition and NCO training tradition in place in a way that the British Army is having to invent, after all, because the British Army.
Well, actually, you're right, aren't you? Because if you think of Colonel Krug at Hillman, I mean, he's exceptional in crew experience. Yeah. You think of that young lieutenant at Utah Beach, who has got an Iron Cross First Class and as an Eastern Front veteran. Even at Omaha Beach, there is. I mean, just to sort of actually back up what you're saying, Al.
Yeah.
That actually, amongst all the kind of Ost battalions and sort of Eastern troops who don't want to be there and aren't really interested in fighting, there is absolutely, you're quite right, that spine of pretty decent, experienced officers and senior NCOs. So I would back up on that.
And lots of well-motivated Fallschirmjäger and all that sort of thing.
All that kind of thing as well. But I suppose what my point about that is that, if a sign of, one of the criticisms against the British and indeed the Americans and the Canadians is that they're all a bit sheep-like, and they don't have that kind of tactical flair and ability to initiative in the same way that perhaps the Germans do. But actually, what D-Day shows you is, if you want to look at sort of how good an army is, it's how good is it at adapting to an alien situation for which it's not prepared. And D-Day is that situation, because nothing that they've prepared actually happens because of the appalling weather and the kind of chaos on the beaches and the tides being much higher than they should be and all the rest of it. And yet they still pull it off, and they pull it off.
But even that in the telling of D-Day is kind of like, they have to postpone for a day because of the weather, and then Ike says, let's go, and then so D-Day's on. Not like and the consequences of that decision for how the operation run are X, Y, Z. It's sort of so the parachute drops are scattered. Well, what does that mean for airborne landings? If you're scattered, it means you're immediately in a state of complete disorganisation, especially as a lot of the way they've been airborne forces rehearse for battle is they lorry up, they get out of a lorry at a place to say, well, this is where you've landed, and now you've got to tab 5 miles to your objectives or whatever. That's how they've been practicing, because obviously it's impractical to have transport aircraft dropping people all the time, and anyway, the transport fleet, even by the time of D-Day, isn't up to the strength required to put in 3 divisions. So, I mean, and I sort of think, but do you compare this to Veritable, by which time the British 21st Army Group, Canadian 1st Army, the Americans, everyone's incredibly experienced, right? And the problem is the weather. The problem again is the weather. So they're by then they're super experienced. They're super experienced because they've been fighting since June. They're confident because they're winning. They're even with replacements coming through, the training's good, and there is a manpower sort of pinch going on. But because right after all, riflemen are where you're burning people up the most. But the point is then what the weather is the trouble here, the time of year, as much as the Germans being very well experienced and all that sort of stuff. So I sort of think that you can talk about it like that if you want. You can say, the Germans are more experienced, which accords them this advantage and makes them a tough nut to crack. But you've also got to, in which case, how do you explain how D-Day goes? And I've been writing about, for the Commander's book, I've done Alistair Pearson, who's the eight para colonel, who's really, really interesting because in all the accounts, and I got Gale's 1946 with the 6th Airborne Division in Normandy.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant.
And he does the same thing as they all do. They all go on about Pearson was easily the best battalion commander we had in the division, a complete natural soldier with a tactical sixth sense and, quietly spoken and calm under any circumstances. And then he never mentions him again in his account. And in Otway, the Otway account, easily the best battalion commander we had, never mentions him again. And then in the Crookenden book, which
so what's he doing?
Well, I don't know. He's just getting on with it. It's just running a great battalion, winning his battles, but it's really, really interesting because he's one of those people who is absolutely brimful of nous and he's pretty well experienced from North Africa, but again, it's a completely different.
And Sicily, of course, yeah.
Well, Sicily, but the role is so different by the time they get to D-Day because they've worked it out. And also, what happens is 6th Airborne, for instance, they have the Special Service Brigade added to them, and some armoured support, and they basically just become an infantry line division
up on the Breville Ridge, don't they?
Up on the Breville Ridge, Bois de Bavon, on the fight, keeping that. Denying the Germans, that counterflank. And the Germans never really try meaningfully. Once the Bois de Bavon's been taken, once the British have control of the Bois de Bavon, there's never really a proper German effort. Because after all, there's all the tanks coming round to the British efforts to the west of Caen, and they're being drawn into that. But it's really, really interesting because their 6th Airborne are 100% green. They have, they've got a spine of officers through them, but they're 100% green. So it must be the training. The training must be really good.
I think the training is as good as it can be.
Yeah.
In the circumstances, and one of the big circumstances, one of the big barriers is the scale of, you don't have batters in Canada where you can sort of career off and fire as much lead as you like.
Yeah.
It's tiny UK, and as we know, Britain is tiny. It really is small. And what else do you do?
Yeah,
there's no alternative. So you've got the battle schools, you've got all the kind of training of jumping out of landing craft, and frankly, all that training of jumping in and out of landing craft clearly pays off because when you have that mayhem on D-Day itself with the weather and everything, they pull it off.
Yeah,
I mean, when I was doing that Sherwood Rangers book and looking at all those aerial photographs, you suddenly had this complete clarity of just how chaotic it must have been on D-Day. And also how quickly they're adapting to not landing where they're supposed to land. And it's like, okay, but we know enough. We're trained well enough to be able to adapt to this different stretch of the beach from what we're expecting.
Yeah.
And that's got to be down to the training.
But also that shows that what you've been trained to do is contact the enemy and destroy him, not get hung up on locations.
Right,
which is the conversation we were talking about not so long ago. That's Francis Tuker's big thing. He says it's not about location points; it's about contacting the enemy and destroying him and using maneuver to do it. Maneuver and firepower. That if you get hung up on a thing like the monastery at Monte Cassino, you'll get stuck because you're not thinking. You're not thinking about okay, well, how do I get around it? How do I bypass it? And so they've obviously been trained that the thing is to be savvy enough about where the enemy's likely to be to contact him and destroy him, rather than go, we're in the wrong place. Which after all, if supposedly the British Army's problem is that people go, well, we're in the wrong place, can't do anything about that, because we lack initiative, because we've not been trained in initiative, then that brings D-Day itself brings the lie to that idea, doesn't it? Which is anyway, we're going to take a very quick break. Now we need to talk about a Lloyd Carrier, don't we, Jim? Because we're supposed to have done that.
Well, briefly.
Yeah, briefly. Okay. So we're taking a break now. We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back to Weird Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. So Jim, we need to just talk about because this is the podcast's acquisition, isn't it?
Podcast acquisition is the Lloyd Carrier. Yeah, it was really exciting. So I went down with Marcus and with Richard, who is one of the partners in this project. Marcus Bailey is going to be doing all the restoration work, and he's a young mechanical engineer. And the idea is to sort of chart the progress of the restoration of this Lloyd carrier, but also to sort of help establish a new generation of young mechanics and engineers that know about this kind of stuff. And Marcus is a wonderful chap. And anyway, so we went to get it from down in Chichester. And I've got to say, when I first saw it, I thought, okay, yeah, that does look like the remains of a carrier, but the remains was the kind of the optimum word, really. It was pretty rusty, but it all started to sort of clarify, because the most amazing thing is, although the carrier was designed and manufactured by the Vivian Lloyd company, who was an MC winning captain from the First World War, and a post-war engineer. Lloyd uses the chassis of a Fordson truck.
He's no fool. That's what's really interesting about this, isn't it? Is it's made of existing parts.
Yes. So obviously a Fordson truck is longer than the carrier. But when I looked at the rather slightly rust encrusted existing chassis on our carrier, I thought, gosh, okay, well, that's quite a lot smaller. But you can see that it's one and exactly the same, along with the same drive shaft, the same differentials, all the rest of it, and axes. It's exactly the same as the Fordson truck. And there was a Fordson truck chassis with its steering wheel, four wheels, all the rest of it, looking a little bit longer. But the basic, you can see where you would chop it off, and you can see how you would change it. But Marcus just looked at that and went, oh, that's just absolutely perfect. That's completely mint. That's, not a problem at all. That's fantastic. Then it also came with a complete set of wheels with rubber on, which hadn't perished at all.
Amazing. That is amazing.
Amazing. And Marcus just looked at that and said, oh, yeah, give those wheels a quick shot blast. They'll be absolutely good as new. So you just think, okay, great. Then there's all the suspension. So all those, we've got another set of all the suspension. Then he's looking at the Ford, I think, is it a V8? I think it's a V8 engine. And again, he thought that looked okay. The transmission, the gearbox looked a little bit kind of sort of rusty on the outside. But again, Marcus and Richard were kind of sort of, not doing too much teeth sucking at all on that one. I mean, they said, yeah, it might look a bit rusty on the inside. But he said, bottom dollar, it'll be fine on the inside. He said, it might need a bit of work, but, there was nothing. He wasn't remotely daunted by any of this. So anyway, so we loaded it all up at kind of, sort of how do we strap it all down? So it was on the back of an Ivor Williams trailer, two Ivor Williams trailers, and we sort of took it all the way back to Wiltshire, and we managed to get the old body in. And bless him, I mean, Marcus has already got to work. He's taken off the old tracks from the original, and he's meticulously photographing every bit of it, and everything that he does, he photographs. So he's got a record of every step of the way, and he's absolutely mustard king. I mean, he really couldn't be keener, which is great. But anyway, we did record a little podcast while we were going about.
Brilliant.
So I think that's going to come out on Thursday or next week or something. But it was a amazingly exciting day, I have to say. It really, really was. And
what do we know of its provenance?
Well,
they made 29,000, so 26,000. So
26,000 of these, which were then obviously it was a bit like kind of the Spitfire and Supermarine. They weren't all made by Supermarine itself. Where, Lloyd was a pretty small company, and so lots of them were made by Ford and by Dennis, who still make trucks and things like that, and the Wolseley car company. Our one was found in a farm in near Bethune on the Somme, and the guy who found it said, be careful of reading too much into that, because he said, typically what you wouldn't sort of have Second Army kind of passing through and oh dear, my Lloyd carrier's gone kaput, I'll just leave it by this farm for the farmer to use. So what tended to happen was they'd end up might get damaged or something, they'd end up at some repair depot. They might go back to the front, they might not go to the front, but after the war, they're all kind of auctioned off. And there'll be a kind of sort of, an auction of old kit and trucks and stuff and carriers. And lots of farmers bought them because they're ideal farm vehicles for towing and dragging stuff. And the tracks on ours have got an extra bit of metal every kind of fourth track, every fourth section.
Right.
for digging into deeper ground.
Oh, that's interesting.
And his view was it had been used in forestry work.
Right. Okay.
Who knows? So it was probably did see service in northern France.
Yeah.
But whether it was left there in Bethune on its way through, or whether it was sort of got there afterwards is, anyone's guess. I mean, we're what they're going to do is try and find a sort of a serial number somewhere.
Yeah.
Which then gives us the lead we want.
Do some tech int. Do some tech int on it. Yeah.
Do some tech int on it. But yeah. But no, it's exciting. So he's got cleared out that helped Marcus clear out that workshop which was taken over, and that was pretty grim.
The $64,000 question that our listeners will be dying to hear the answer to
is how long is it going to take to do?
Yeah, exactly. What's our time scale?
I don't know. I mean, both Marcus and Richard are very keen to get on with it. So, a year maybe?
Right.
That kind of neck of the woods.
That sounds good.
I mean, it doesn't sound too long, does it? I mean, otherwise it just gets a bit boring, doesn't it?
Maybe in time for Warfest Dry.
Yeah, Warfest Dry, not Warfest Vi, I think.
Yeah.
But we might kind of bring up what we've got on for Warfest Vi.
Fantastic.
It's an amazing thing, though. I mean, the other thing is all the panels, all the kind of sort of metal work that goes around it is all there. That's all.
It would be fascinating to know if we could what we can find out about it, and because ideally you want to return it to its original markings, don't you? That's the.
Well, yeah. I mean, our sort of vague plan at the moment is to do it in honour of Ginger Pierce.
Yeah.
And do it in the 4th Dorset, part of the 43rd Wessex Division.
Yeah.
And obviously Ginger was a Bren gunner on a carrier with the 4th Dorsets and the carrier platoon. Yeah. But yeah, if we find a bit more information and find out that it was actually part of the 52nd Lowland Division, we'll have a chance.
Well, my pal who does the decals for Airfix, that's his job.
Yeah. He's keen to help.
He's keen to help, which is kind of exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely
brilliant. He did the markings on the new Cromwell kit they did recently. Anyway,
nice.
Very good, very strong. Anyway, so we will be documenting the restoration of the carrier on our Twitter, which is @WeHaveWaysPod. But to see exclusive videos of the vehicle, make sure to join us on our member site, which is patreon.com/WeHaveWays. Patreon. So they were there last week, as James says, to record the carrier's arrival. That's being edited and stuck together now. And of course, Monday night's live cast stuff is still going on. If you join the Patreon, and a pair of silver wings read by Willow May Murray is still going. So because if you don't know about our Patreon, basically there's additional content in the form of some films. You get to see stuff first. And we've done a series of audio books of things that are out of print or things that are still in print, like James's Second World War fiction, read by a variety of people, myself included. And if that's your bag, it's on the Patreon. Now, should we do a couple? Have we got time for a couple of questions, Jim?
We definitely got a couple. We were going to talk about MacArthur.
Let's talk about Manila. Let's talk about Manila.
Or do we save that for another one?
No, let's talk about Manila because
and MacArthur, because I was thinking about operations in the Second World War by the Allies which were unnecessary. How often was blood spilled that didn't need to be spilled?
Oh God.
I mean, I'm not just thinking sort of wise after the event. I'm thinking kind of at the time where you're sort of thinking, really, did you need to go straight through the Hurtcombe Forest, for example?
Yeah.
Possibly not.
Yeah.
Did you need to go to Arnhem? I don't know, but I won't go into that one. But the interesting thing about the Philippines is there is this complete split between the Navy and the Army about what you should do. So there's this whole plan about let's use China, let's kind of help the Chinese resuscitate.
And the reason we're talking about this is happening at the same time as Veritable, right? Isn't it?
This is happening at the same time as Veritable, Yeah, exactly. But yes, exactly. In 1945, February.
But also, oh my God, when you start reading about it.
Yes, but it needs some context.
Yeah.
Because the Americans' initial plan is, well, let's help kind of, get the Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army into some kind of shape, and then we can help them kind of fight back against the Japanese. And the great thing is you can, you're then sponsoring other people to do the hard yard so that your young men don't have to fight. And it's all very sensible. But it becomes very, very clear pretty quickly that is just not going to be possible because they're so impoverished. The Chinese army is so impoverished, the civilians around are so impoverished, it's so corrupt in China. It's just an absolute basket case, and it's just never ever going to happen. Then you've got the British are completely kind of totally overstretched in what they're already doing, and their hands are full with Burma and defending Northeast India and all the rest of it, so they're not going to help. So Ernest King, who has always been very keen on a kind of Pacific first, not a Germany first policy anyway, and he's the overall head of the US head of the Navy. He's on the joint, he's one of the US chiefs of staff, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the rest of it. He's absolutely one of the top bods, and he is the biggest kind of sort of champion for the Pacific policy, other than MacArthur. And General MacArthur is the supreme Allied commander in the Southwest Pacific. And he has come out of retirement once the war begins. And he is the only field marshal in the US Army. He gets that appointment when he goes back. He is also an ex-chief of staff of the US Army from 1930 to 1935, usually a four-year post, except in the exceptional circumstances of the Second World War. But he does an extra year, and that takes him up to 1935, and then he goes back over to the Philippines, where he's already been sort of, the top military guy in the 1920s. So it's a place he knows incredibly well. Even in the start of his career, in sort of 1905 or 1906 or something, he goes over. His father's in the army as well, and he gets appointed as his father's ADC in Tokyo, and then in Hong Kong, and then in India and Quetta and all the rest of it. So he really does know the Far East. There's this amazing quote from someone who met him in 1905 in Tokyo, and he says, Arthur MacArthur, who is MacArthur's father, was the most flamboyantly egotistical man I'd ever seen until I met his son. And this is one of his sort of problems, is he's got, he's a sort of Trump-like narcissist, and massive ego, and also a bit my way or the highway. Well, and you have this sort of, on the one hand, you've got Ernest King going, it's all got to be about the Navy. It's about strangling Japan. It's about cutting off all their supplies. It's about sinking all their ships, all of which sounds incredibly sensible to me. And then you've got MacArthur going, I've been kicked out of Philippines. Philippines is my manor. I will return.
I want a battle.
And if that takes, I want a battle. I'm going to win. I'm going to kick that Jap ass. And if that takes lots of American lives and Filipino civilian lives as well, that's the price you have to pay, but that's going to happen. But Ernest King, who has been getting on with the job of isolating Japan, is, by the beginning of 1945, has done an incredible job. I mean, mainly US submarines, which we talked about before, have been responsible for destroying 2/3 of the shipping that the Japanese begun in 1944 by the end of 1944. I mean, it is absolutely incredible the amount of shipping, Japanese shipping, that is going to the bottom, predominantly sunk by US submarines. And also in 1944, you have these two big naval battles. You have the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, and then you have the Battle of Leyte Gulf at the end of October 1944. And those are the two last throws of the dice of the Japanese combined fleet. And they're finished. And they're finished because they can't possibly keep up. And we were talking about it the other day, weren't we, about the carrier Taiho, which is so sophisticated and so brilliant, but no one actually knows how to kind of man it. And of course, it gets sunk in its first engagement at the Battle of the Philippine Sea on whatever it was, the 26th of June or whatever it is, 19th of June, 1944. And so you can't help but think that King is completely right. But they've done this landing on Leyte. So the Philippines, for those who don't know, Philippines is an archipelago. So it's this huge archipelago of lots of sort of jagged-shaped islands, of which Leyte is one of the smallest ones in the sort of central southern bit. They've taken that, and that's all fine. Then they've taken Mindoro, which is an island south of Luzon and south of Manila Manila Bay. And it's kind of, what's the point of taking Luzon? Because on Luzon, there is General Yamashita's 14th Army.
234,000 Japanese
and
soldiers.
The rest, 267,000.
Yeah. Well, yes, and you end up with this extraordinary thing where MacArthur doesn't believe the intelligence estimates, don't you?
It's not that he does believe it. He refuses to accept. He just ignores it. He goes rubbish. He goes bunk. It's only 152,000.
Yeah.
But 152,000 is still an awful lot of Japanese.
Well, it's what he's got. It's what MacArthur has at his disposal, basically, isn't it? So it's 1-to-1, isn't it? So which is, after all, what is it? 3-to-1. We're always told is the ideal attacking ratio, isn't it? And
and he doesn't really. He doesn't have that. But what he does have, of course, is he has massive force multipliers because the Americans have considerably larger amounts of weaponry than the Japanese do. The Japanese have men, but they're mainly armed with, small artillery pieces, only 150 light tanks, mortars, machine guns, rifles, and grenades, and obviously swords. What they don't have is heavy guns. They don't have many anti-tank guns. They don't have that huge arsenal of supplies that the Americans have.
But what they do have,
his ability is there on the defence.
Well, and the determination to fight until they're all dead. So the interesting thing about this is you can always present the way the way the odds are stacked against the Japanese. And if you would say, if they were a Western army, you'd think, well, they're going to throw in the towel then. If these were British soldiers faced with these disadvantages, they'd surrender. It wouldn't be worth it.
No, drawbridge down, flag up.
Exactly. Whereas what you end up with is a house by house battle in Manila.
And the rest of it. So Yamashita is a brilliant general. Yeah. He's known as the Tiger of Malaya, and that's because of his brilliant performance in 1942, where he sweeps into Malaya, completely knocks out all the British. He's the commander of the capture of Singapore and all the rest of it. This is brilliant method, brilliant operational method, brilliant tactical method. He's a very, very learned man, and compared with a lot of Japanese generals, he's sort of marginally more humane than most of them, and he's certainly more intellectual. And he completely understands what the Americans are about. He understands what they're going to do. And Luzon is a kind of odd-shaped island, very sort of tall. It's sort of bulbously kind of sort of mountainous at the top. Yeah. And there is this sort of valley that goes down from. He basically realizes where they're going to land. Yeah. Which is in the Lingayen Gulf, which is this sort of. It's sort of north of Manila. Then there's this sort of western ridge of mountains that runs down to the Bataan Peninsula. Then there is another eastern ridge of mountains, which then extends up into the northern part of Luzon. But in the middle of that, running from the Lingayen Gulf all the way down to Manila and the Manilan Gulf, is this sort of lower valley. Yeah, and Yamashita completely predicts that General Walter Kruger, who is the German-born general of the US 6th Army, is going to land in the Lingayen Gulf and then make hell for leather to Clark Field, which is the major airfield complex, and then go down into Manila. Yeah. And of course, that's exactly what happens. And so he divides his 267,000 strong force of 14th Army into these different groups. So he's got the Shobu group, which is the largest, and that's 150,000 men. And they're going to be in the Carabello Mountains, which is the mountains to kind of sort of to the east of Lingayen Gulf, sort of spreading up northwards and kind of running down the kind of eastern spine of Luzon, and hitting the flanks of the Americans as they're heading southwards towards Manila. So that's the Shobu group, and then he's got the Shimbu group, which is 80,000 strong. And they're going to be in the Sierra Madre Mountains, which are east of Manila, directly east of Manila. Then there's the Kembu group, which is going to be in the Zambales Mountains, which is immediately west of Manila.
Yeah.
And then you've got the naval troops, which is the fourth group, under Rear Admiral Iwabushi Sanji.
And that's the
and that's the nub of it.
That's the nub of it. I mean, the thing is Yamashita isn't fighting for a victory, is he? He knows he can't win.
No, he's fighting. He's fighting to hold Luzon and grind down the Americans for as long as possible. He knows he's beat.
But what the important thing to remember is why he's doing that. He's doing that to strengthen the government's hand in negotiation when it comes to a peace treaty.
Yes.
And the idea is to get the Americans to spill so much blood that in the end the Americans think it's not worth it. And the unconditional surrender comes off the table. Japan, can have basically some say in a post-war settlement. And that's why they're fighting on now. Or at least Yamashita's fighting on now. And he's doing things that reflect that attitude, in that he's trying to make sure that American prisoners of war are properly treated. He's trying to make sure that civilian population is dealt with in a humanitarian way. And in lots of ways, it's an echo a bit of tales of German officers on the Western Front who start suddenly behaving with their prisoners because they're thinking, well, the game's up, we're still fighting. But he openly expresses that it's to strengthen the government's hand at the negotiating table in a way that you see Germans not talking like that. They just want to go. They're going down with the sinking ship. I mean, it's really interesting to have that, and then that such a brutal campaign should come of that.
What happens is
that's the Navy, isn't it?
Well, this is the problem, because his instructions to Admiral Iroboshi are destroy all the port facilities and then bug out and join the Shobu group. Not Shobu group, sorry, the group in the Sierra Madre, the Shimbu group in the Sierra Madre Mountains to the east of Manila. Yeah. But Iwabushi's in the Navy and not the Army. So although Yamashita overranks him, is a different Army and Navy. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy have never been particularly good bedfellows in any part of the war. Yeah. And so when the 37th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division are sent south by Kruger to kind of rush Manila, and there is then the 11th Airborne Division, I think, from 8th Army, which is Eichelberger's, which I remember we were talking to John McManus about some months ago. Eichelberger's 8th Army then also land a couple of divisions as well. Yeah. And so these 3 divisions are kind of sort of homing in on Manila. And at that point, Admiral Iwabushi goes, actually, do you know what? No, we're going to defend Manila. And Yamashita, who's in his sort of mountain headquarters, can't really do anything about it. And so what happens was, instead of having this sort of triumphal return from MacArthur on his birthday on the 26th of January, in actual fact, they're behind schedule anyway. So that comes and goes. And then they find that actually the Japanese are defending every sort of house, every street, every suburb. Yeah. And it just turns into an absolute bloodbath. And it's a sort of repetition of the rape of Nanking by the Japanese.
But it starts off as the Americans, as they come into the city, are mobbed by crowds. There's celebrations. There's a brewery that they get their hands on. And they drive GIs drinking beer from helmets and all that.
That's right.
And the thing of, the crowds gathering and celebrating, and the GIs getting laid, and all this sort of, victory stuff. And then the Japanese start mortaring the crowds. The crowds all disappear, and the soldiers are left to defend themselves. And then mortaring stops. The crowds come back out and carry on partying. And there's this very odd, they think they're being liberated, and like you say, the Japanese Navy are not going to have that. It's quite extraordinary. It turns into, rolling howitzers up the street and firing at buildings at point blank range, and having to burn buildings completely to the ground, and then the air raid shelters under the buildings being full of Japanese and then being sealed in there. It's
absolutely appalling. And there is also this moment where they liberate Santos Thomas University on the 3rd of February. Yeah. And there's some 500 prisoners there, of which 275 are Americans who were captured back in 1942. And of course, in the kind of 2.5 years since that's happened, the whole world has just completely changed, and when Americans that prisoners there, they're still wearing Tommy helmets, or would have been still wearing Tommy helmets last time they were in action. And suddenly there's all these GIs looking completely different, with massively sophisticated weaponry, and it's sort of like an alien world. But I think what's just is so horrific is it's a repeat of the rape of Nanking. So completely. lots of civilians are raped. There's this absolutely horrible description in Max Hastings' book about this 15-year-old girl being raped in the street, and then the person who has assaulted her then gets out his bayonet and slits her from her kind of, from right up the middle, and leaves her to die. And women and children are kind of hustled into halls and buildings, and they are told the orders are kill lots of civilians, but don't waste ammunition on it. So kill them another way. In other words, burn them, bayonet them, behead them, all that kind of stuff. And it is an absolute horror story. Of the First Order. And I've got to say, I found the whole thing incredibly shocking.
Well, it's 100,000 people in who live in Manila are killed.
100,000 people killed, and most of the Japanese naval force are killed as well. About 3,500 managed to escape. And I think 8,000. There's 8,000 American casualties taking Manila. But 100,000 civilians. It's so hard to get your head around that number. And also, of course, Manila has this reputation of being, one of the most beautiful cities in the Far East. It's this sort of Intramuros is this ancient sort of Spanish walled city. It's known for its sort of beautiful cobbled streets and its terraces and facades and all the rest of it. And what happens is, as the Americans get stuck, they do what they always do and what the Allies always do, which is, no building is worth more than kind of American blood. So therefore it has to be destroyed. And so out come these 155 millimeter artillery pieces, and they're firing these at kind of point blank range at kind of beautiful old buildings and colonial buildings and what have you. And the whole place is just absolutely smashed. And of course, a lot of those Far East buildings, apart from the colonial buildings, are wooden and they get burned to the ground. And, Manila is just utterly destroyed. The heart of it is just completely ripped out. And so it's a this terrible tragedy on so many different levels. Well, and there is this big burning question that the whole thing was probably completely unnecessary.
That's what I was just going to get to, is that it's so that MacArthur can return on his birthday, and none of it.
And it didn't happen anyway.
None of that comes to pass, and 100,000 civilians are killed in the process. I mean, it's
but it gets worse, because Manila finally falls on the 3rd of March. But Luzon is still being defended at the end of the war. There's still Japanese. Japanese are starving. They're dying of typhus. They're kind of eating bats to survive. They're cannibalizing their dead to survive, but they're still holding out. It's reckoned that 1 million Filipinos are killed during the Second World War, most of which is from January to August 1945. I mean, it is truly horrific.
And again, this brings you back. All of this feeds into the decisions that lead up to the use of the atomic bomb. That it's not just about the invasion of Japan, is it? It's about dealing with the Japanese, full stop, wherever they are.
It is. It's this mounting anger, frustration that why are you still fighting? Why aren't you surrendering like any normal enemy would surrender at this stage of the war? You've got 88% of your economy is devoted to defense by by the end of 1944. You're absolutely stuffed. You're completely strangled. And that goes to the firebombing of Tokyo as well, which we should talk about at another time. But I mean, if you look at them, it's really worth looking at Google Earth and having a look at the Philippines and looking at Luzon. I mean, it is an island. There's no getting away from it. And if it's an island and the Japanese are on it, then
just leave them there.
Leave them there. It's the same with Peleliu. I mean, Peleliu is exactly the same. There's 7x3 that they insist on fighting. They don't need to. Particularly since Admiral King's naval policy is working so well. They have complete command of the Pacific Seas.
But if you've got an army, Jim, you're going to use it, aren't you? I mean, it's...
Well, you are Phil MacArthur.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing is how he's allowed to get away with it. And he's allowed to get away with it because he's so far away, and because the other American chiefs of staff and the combined chiefs of staff have got their hands full destroying Hitler.
Well, and also it's keeping him occupied. I mean, on the subject of other people destroying Hitler, he's very unhappy that Eisenhower, who was his junior, is sort of getting more attention than him, isn't he? He's very pissed off about that. And sort of threatens to throw his toys out the pram about it as well, doesn't he? There's that,
completely.
To do with war loans and all that sort of stuff. If Ike's name's above his, he won't take part, and all that sort of thing. It's
absolutely extraordinary.
Egotism is on another scale. Anyway,
he's clearly a bit mad.
Yeah, that's all we got time for, I'm afraid. On that note of MacArthur's mad, we'll leave that hanging. I mean, like Operation Veritable, though, we started off with good intentions and got distracted along the way. We're back on Thursday with a stunning episode featuring US historian Tammy Davis-Biddle, who, until she recently retired, was the Professor of National Security at the US Army War College. And we're talking about accelerationism in war and the bombing campaign and the last phase of the strategic bombing campaign in Europe. And how you get your head around that, how they end up in that set of circumstances. From 1939, where they don't want to damage German private property, to firebombing entire cities. Like, how do you do that in 6 years flat? Then on Sunday, we've got more of your family stories. It's a lovely series. I'm really enjoying reading those. Keep sending them in. We're building up a wonderful range of personal histories. Thank you all once again for listening. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.